Alright, so my name is Aniuska and I am a doctoral student in conflict analysis and resolution over here at NOVA. And what I'm here to talk to you about, it's about exploring portrayals of gender and genocide in art. Now, that's a loaded title because it assumes two things. One, that there's such a thing as genocide art. And second, that there are going to be differences in how gender, men, women, children are portrayed. That is, war art has been in existence historically. If you look at Mesoamerica and the Mayas and the Aztecs and you go to Egypt and the Greeks and all these individuals have monuments in which you could actually see two armies going at each other. You don't need someone to tell you that that's war. You can see it, it's very obvious, but what happens with genocide? Genocide, it's sort of like the second image. You were very good, it's a greeting, but not everyone might interpret it like that. So if I were to show you an image of someone who's a man with the right hand in a box laying down, and there's the hand is sticking out, and there's another man ripping the nails out of that man, and so this hand is tied to a table, there's a man sitting on top of that table, automatically with that freeze image, you would think, ah, that's an instance of torture, right? That's one instance of torture. But if I were to tell you, then there's another image within that series in which it shows soldiers taking away the babies from a woman. And then there's another scene in which those babies, there's a pile of bodies, and then there's a soldier just shooting babies into the air and then going, and then there's another image within that series that shows men blindfolded and tied in with their necks with a pit. And then they are being killed while they're tied and blindfolded, and then they're falling into that pit. Once you have that sequence, you have a narrative. The individual image doesn't really say anything. You might interpret it as individual instances of a massacre, which a massacre is not always genocide, is it? You might interpret it as just simply a woman whose baby might be taken away. Hey, social services. You might think it's just torture. You need the narrative that connects all of those images. And that is what happens with genocide. Genocide is not an act, it's a process. And you need the narrative behind that in order to actually understand it, which is why it's very difficult to consider something genocide art. What happens with genocide art? Genocide art, that masculinity of the men, it's stripped away. Even though there are perpetrators that are men, the masculinity, the embodiment of the men as being strong, is stripped away in those who are the victims. And that makes the image of the man as portraying art even more dramatic to take in. Because it equalizes, which is kind of sad, it equalizes gender relations, but at the same time, it makes the situation of the male as portrayed in art even more dramatic. Why? Well, how many of you are part of the so-called womankind in this room? If you have to, come on, raise your hands. Womankind.
Oh my God.
I only see the females. But if I were to say, how many of you are part of mankind? How many of you would? There you go. Everyone. So, the concept of mankind as something that is equal to humanity and includes men, women, and children, it's male-driven. It's machista. Alright? So, it is because we are talking about man. Not about womankind. Not everyone here, it's a part of that. It's mankind. So, it's a concept that unites everyone, but at the same time, it's a concept that is strong. And that is stricken away when you look at genocide art, and especially the men. Because the men, from being strong, from being masculine, end up being strict, they're taken away, they're deprived of that identity of the protector, of the aggressor. And that makes it even more dramatic. So it equalizes this with a woman, because the ultimate fate is genocide, it's extermination, it's group discrimination, isn't it? We, though the image is intended to create empathy in us, we don't see ourselves reflected in it. They're not human, they're not something you don't see on an everyday basis. So you have no empathy, right? And then when you fall into the skull part, now you see the skulls, now you see the bones. Once again, we humanize it. Why do you humanize it? Because you see yourself reflected in the skulls. You know that ultimately, that's what you're going to be it. Thus, the portrayal of gender in genocide art reflects the social differentiations that we all have in society. It equalizes them, but at the same time contributes to whether or not we humanize them as just men and women, part of a group, or men and women, just completely different. Because we go through the different stages and we are affected by how that is portrayed. Healthy, I see myself. Not healthy, that's not me. Skull and bones, I'm definitely going there. And then, when you look at the images, either in paintings or like in this case, which by the way, these are like glass panels and it's all full of skulls. That's in Cambodia. When you look at all those numbers, humanity increases again because now you can quantify genocide. And you equalize it again in terms of gender because you don't know who that skull belongs to. You don't know if it's a woman or if it's a man. Right? And that is reflected in photography, but also in painting. And that's basically it. So thank you for your attention.
Very good. Very good.
Genocide cannot exist without identity. That is, because it's a process, the group that is perpetrating the genocide is defining itself versus the group that it's being targeted. Thus, you start building the rhetoric, you start building that identity. We are superior. We are this way. We have a historical claim to actually do this to them. Thus, look at the Rwandan genocide. Look at the Holocaust. There's always that notion that there's a legitimacy to our group identity and why we're doing this. At the same time, you could have a random group of people that have no idea that they're going to be targeted for genocide, and their identity is built because they're targeted.
Wow.
Thus, they may have a previous group identity before the genocide, or may not. But if they don't, they create it because they're targeted. Thus, they're forced to become a cohesive unit. So identity is, without the notion of identity, you can't have genocide, because otherwise it would just simply be random targetings of people. And it's an expression that used by a scholar called Catherine Dean, and she talks about the exhaustion of empathy as it relates to Holocaust. Now, it's only about Holocaust that she's talking, but when you really look at gender, and especially, well, in this case as portrayed in art, there is already an exhaustion of empathy from what you're saying as it relates to gender vulnerability. Because we're not empathetic if the victim is a woman. Unless you're in a society in which women are overprotected. But we're not necessarily outraged. And I think her expression precludes the notion of genocide. It's just heightened in genocide, and as it relates to the Holocaust, because we're bombarded by the evidence of it. And especially as it relates to the Nazi Holocaust, because it's within our own hemisphere, it's the West. So we are overexposed to it, and there comes a point that if you look at symbols of that Holocaust, you're not necessarily appalled. It's when they're reframed that you become appalled. It's when someone points out to you why that's affecting you, then you realize it. But she uses, and I think it's very unique, the expression, the exhaustion of empathy.